Hello, everyone. Welcome to Careers in Death Care, a day in the life of a green cemetery director with myself, Mandy Benwaleed, and John Christian Phifer. First of all, our apologies for the slight delay today. Of course, technical difficulties. I think we're all used to it by now after almost close to 2 years of doing all this
Yeah,
stuff online,
yeah,
right?
I'm for sure used to it.
Right.
I take it as like rain on a wedding day. It's good luck, right?
Yes, absolutely. This is going to be a
Absolutely.
great talk. So today's event is part of TalkDeath's new series, A Day in the Life, where we interview professionals within the death care and end of life space to help demystify this work and give you a solid idea of the career opportunities within this space, and of course, to encourage everyone to talk death. This video and our upcoming Day in the Life videos will continue to be part of the hashtag Talk Death web series that we started way back in 2014. And we're so thrilled to be doing this in partnership with EOL. And of course, a big thank you to the team over at EOL for always putting these together with us. We are so grateful. So, just before we kind of dive right in, we'll of course start with some quick introductions. For those of you that don't know me, I am the co founder and editor of Talk Death, where our mission is to encourage positive and constructive conversations around death and dying and help people make educated end of life decisions for themselves and for their loved ones. I'm also the founder and president of Keeper, which is a collaborative online memorial platform where friends and family can remember and celebrate those who are dearly missed with stories and tribute messages, photos, milestones, and so much more. And we also now offer a virtual and hybrid memorial service event facilitation. Much more importantly, though, we are joined today by John Christian Phifer, who spearheaded the creation of Tennessee's first nature preserve for natural burial, Larkspur Conservation. He is a licensed funeral director and embalmer, certified end of life doula, funeral celebrant, and home funeral guide. And John Christian currently serves as the executive director of Larkspur Conservation and as the president of the Conservation Burial Alliance, which is a collaborative of conservation burial grounds and invested allies that foster the conservation and sustainable management of land with natural burial for the benefit of people and the planet. Through Larkspur Conservation, John Christian works to educate and empower the public by bridging environmental advocacy and end of life care, something that we can all very much get behind. Thank you so much, John Christian. We are so excited for you to be joining us today to really be talking to you about your journey opening up a green cemetery or a conservation cemetery, talking to us about what a green cemetery does, a green cemetery director does day to day, and how your work really helps create these beautiful and meaningful end of life options while preserving nature.
Thanks, Mandy. Thank everybody at Talk Death Daily and EOL. I'm excited to be here to share with you. And hello to everyone in Vermont. And let's see, where else did I see in the chat? We've got Vermont and Iowa and Georgia, Spain, NYC, so many different places, and Middle Tennessee.
Cool.
Haley, it's good to see everyone joining in. And
Or
I'm really,
Nashville.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
just really in Colorado and Canada. I'm glad to be here to
Canada.
share. I hope that my perspective can be useful to everyone. I know everywhere is different, but I think there's some standard basics that I'm going to be able to share that I hope will resonate with everybody, and kind of enlighten you as to the path and the why we do what we do. And I'm just happy to be here. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for giving us your time today. Um, so I thought we would dive right in. Wow, I love everyone commenting. By the way, I'm in Canada, so representing all the Canadians out here
Mm.
right now as well. All right, so let's kind of dive right in. I really want to kind of get to know a bit more of you because it's not just anyone that wakes up one day and says, I'm going to open up a conservation burial ground.
True.
So what is your background, John Christian? What's the path that led you to become to open a conservation burial ground? And I always like to ask this question with, what's your why? We all have a why with what we do.
Yeah. Well, I got asked this question the other day while I was standing in the nature preserve with family after a burial, and I started doing the math, and I guess it's right at 23 years that I've been doing the work. I started just outside of high school, um, but 23 years in the funeral world. Like you said, I'm a started as a funeral director and embalmer, and I've kind of grown away from that, but I've held on to a lot of the knowledge that I gained. But it really, for me, started when I was about 6 with a fork and a grasshopper wrapped in a leaf in the woods next to on the farm where I grew up. I played in Mother Nature. She was my babysitter. I had 2 brothers, and we were just going in and getting into something all the time. But that being said, with my career in funeral service, I feel like I've really come full circle from, as the song said in the beginning, Mother Nature's son, to funeral director and embalmer, and now I'm kind of back to Mother Nature's funeral director, if you will. Although I use funeral director lightly because I feel like I don't so much direct as I guide and help. But yeah, it's interesting. And then right after spending 15 or so years in the conventional funeral setting, where I lived and worked at the funeral home, and I was upstairs, getting up in the middle of the night with the funeral home and going out and bringing people back to the funeral home and doing the embalming and meeting the family the next day and going to the cemetery, all of those elements, for doing it so long, when I made a leap of faith to try to forge a more mindful path here in my own community, I didn't know exactly what that was going to look like, but I took time to really try to reboot, if you will. Traveled around the country. I ended up studying under Jerry Grace Lyons over in the Sebastopol, California area, just north of San Francisco, for home funeral guide training. And I did certification with Taryn Estes at the Conscious Dying Institute for end of life doula training.
Yep.
And like I said just a minute ago, I've been Mother Nature's son for forever, and I've always been dialed into nature. So bringing all of those things into the melting pot, the reason I do it is because I've always had this desire to help the dying and or their family or their friends. And when I say family or friend, when I mean that could be any family, any friend. That the family means so much more today than it did 100 years ago. So your chosen family, your immediate family, your friends, family and friends all together there. So without my funeral industry time, I don't know that I would be where I am and be enlightened to the practices that I've carried with me and that I've also kind of forged and created here in Tennessee. So I'm thankful for that time. And I just try to remind myself to place myself into the family or the dying or nature's shoes, and use that as a guide in making decisions and working with people. Like I said, it's really a melting pot of all of these things, the funerals, the burials, the people. It's all together created what we have today, which is me, this guy that was in the funeral industry that thought I was going to grow old in a funeral home. And, now here I am running a nature preserve, and we're burying people like I did grasshoppers, essentially.
Well, that there was something that there was a different and, I can arguably say better way to
Yes,
be doing what
right.
you do. And so having that hands-on literal experience working with families in a conventional setting or traditional setting, you knew that there was something else there. And
It made it clearer for me to also see the flip side of that coin, to see what the
okay,
other way could look like.
okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. So talking a bit about this conventional side as well,
Mhm.
As a funeral director, you also, of course, worked and had experience in conventional cemeteries. So, talk to us, especially for those of us who might be new to this concept, talk to us about the difference between a conventional cemetery, a green cemetery, and a conservation cemetery, because they're all three different things,
They're all
right?
three unique in their own way. So before making my leap of faith, and I might say leap of faith a few times. I always feel, wasn't there a movie Leap of Faith with Steve Martin? Yeah, so I'm Steve Martin making this leap of faith. So before that time, I was most recently managing a large funeral home, and we had a 150-acre cemetery on the property as well. And it was a conventional cemetery. We had probably 500,000 burials within those 150 acres, and it had been there for 225 years. So when we look at, let's start by saying, when we look at green and natural and conservation, green can just be simple elements such as, I want to use a coffin at my funeral that is made of locally sourced wood,
Mhm.
or I'm going to use a register book that is made of recycled paper, or I'm going to cut down on X, Y, and Z that have a carbon footprint. Natural burial is, and that can be done in a conventional, that green burial can be done in a conventional setting, and it currently is around the country.
Mhm.
Natural burial takes it a step further, where there is absolutely no chemicals, plastics, concretes, or metals used along with any embalming fluids in the burial practices. So that's common if you look back in history to how everybody in America and everyone around the world and throughout time were buried prior to the Civil War. Um, so there are particular areas around the country that may be a natural burial ground that just focus on solely that. There may be some cemeteries that are more conventional and green that have conventional setting burials with densely buried individuals in vaults and caskets alongside individuals that may be buried in biodegradable green or natural fashion. And that's what we would call a hybrid cemetery, where you have a mix of both the conventional method and the more natural or eco-friendly method.
Okay.
Conservation burial is actually what we call the gold standard, or the highest form of eco-friendly burial practice, which is pairing natural burial, where you don't use any concretes, plastics, metals, steel, chemicals, etc. Reduce your carbon footprint and pair that natural burial activity with conservation. And when I say with conservation, I mean a conservation easement generally held by a third party conservation organization. For Larkspur, ours is the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is very well known for their conservation efforts. They're very well respected in the conservation world, and they currently have 119 million acres conserved or protected in the world. And Larkspur is their first active natural burial ground that pairs that
Wow.
conservation element, creating a conservation burial ground.
Congrats. That's
Yeah,
amazing. It's
thank
very
you.
impressive.
Another
Okay.
thing that I will say is Larkspur is a 501c3. We're a
Okay.
nonprofit organization dedicated to conserving land through a revival of these natural burial practices. And
Mhm.
we provide natural burial paired with that conservation element. Um, what it really creates, and what's unique about a conservation burial ground, is it creates a community green space
Mhm.
that is protected. The ecology is managed. It's open daily for mindful recreation and hiking, nature study, and contemplation. We have as many people that visit the preserve that are there for nature study and hiking and exercise as we do that are there to visit someone that's buried.
Amazing. So I watched a video that a documentary that is now doing the circuit at certain festivals, and
Mhm.
it's called "Bury Me at Taylor Hollow," and it features you and Larkspur and the creation of Larkspur. It's wonderful. I believe that John Christian's able to send it to you all. You can let us know in the chat if you're interested in it, but we will also share it once it is officially released after it is finished on the festival circuit. But something that really stuck out to me that I think is connected to this is that at Larkspur, you're only using maybe a third to a quarter of the land on actual burials. So, would you say that Larkspur and even the goal of conservation burial sites is to preserve the land first and then create, a beautiful resting place second?
Yes, to us, the land is equally as important as the family and the people that are buried, the families that come there and the people that are buried there.
Right.
So by conserving land and using natural burial as a tool, our graves are never reused.
Mm.
Unlike Great Britain or some other, and I'm speaking as an American, so please bear with me. I've studied and learned as much as I can, but I'm speaking from my experience. So when I say unlike Great Britain and other European areas, in America we are fortunate to have a lot more land that we have access to in need of conservation, where
Mm-hmm.
land and space is limited in other parts of the world. But for us, where we have access to land that is in need of conservation and restoration. And when we invite families into the preserve, it's really a different experience from that of a conventional setting. Um, One of the things that we do, and one of the ways that we manage how we use the land, because conservation is so important, and like you were saying, in the conventional setting, there are so many people buried there, and our focus is more in balance so that we can
Mm-hmm.
be together, people and nature, because we are actually one. At Larkspur, we actually identify areas within the nature preserve that are suitable for restoration and burial.
Okay.
That may be an open woodland area or an open meadow area where erosion will not play a factor, where there are certain species that need to be restored. Um, and then what we do is we reverse grid. And that may sound really strange, but in a conventional setting, when you go to select a grave site, there's a grid overlaying the entire flat lawn area where you select a grave. And
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like a piece of graph paper. They just cross a box or write your name in it and it's reserved. Well, for us, we reverse grid, meaning that we actually map our burial areas as burials occur. So when a family has a death, they're invited to select from a range of different ecosystems or areas within the preserve that we have already identified that could use help with restoration, and areas that will not actively harm current ecosystems that are thriving.
That's amazing.
So yeah, so our method allows for a burial density that's very low. And what burial density is how many people or how many graves you have in a particular area of land. So
Mm-hmm.
for us, generally 100 to 300 burials could take place in an acre, depending on the needs of the ecosystem and whether the graves are in that woodland area or in the meadow area.
Mm-hmm.
In comparison, in a conventional setting, there are as many as 1,000 people generally on average in 1 acre of space, because they're shoulder to shoulder, and you're maximizing that space in a way. That method's not ecologically responsible, and it
Yep.
degrades the environment. So when we look at what we're doing, we make sure that our impacts are low and work with the ecosystem. And every grave space or grave site actually becomes an opportunity for restoration, where we come in with the family after a burial and we have a native wildflower planting if we're in the meadow, or if we in the fall if we're in the woodland, we have a tree planting,
Mm-hmm.
or we work with ferns and different species depending on where the burial is taking place.
That's amazing. Yeah, and it really is different. And for those of you that maybe don't know too much about the ins and outs of a traditional cemetery, there's literally software that's built, mapping specialists, development specialists that will have like aerial views. They even use drones in some cases to map out the cemetery to be able to use as much of the land as possible, as John Christian mentioned, shoulder to shoulder, which obviously is very challenging when you're trying to dig graves and there's caskets right next to each other. But that's also why so many cemeteries require metal vaults or concrete liners,
That is
and things
correct.
that, of course, are just adding more and more things into the ground. So this is so unique to be able to do this. Um, and I'm seeing so many questions come through. So let's keep going. And I have so many questions that we're going to have to get into in a moment.
Yeah, we'll get into them.
What I do want to find out. Oh yeah, what I do want to find out is, obviously Larkspur is very different in so many ways, but talk us
Mhm.
through the experience that a family um, experiences when they are at Larkspur. What is your steps when they are ready to bury their loved one? What can they expect?
So we have both people that will contact us ahead of time that want to go through a planning session. It's kind of our education element.
Mhm.
And we just demystify death, and we work through all the ins and outs and answer all their questions about natural burial, conservation burial, cremation, biosumation, all the different elements that are out there today. But at Larkspur, when a family has a death, we invite them to come walk the preserve with us and get in tune with nature and really try to connect in a very special way. Um, some people might call it spiritual, some people might call it meditative. Just connect with nature when making a selection. On our walk, we start at our trailhead and we'll generally meander up through the preserve, and we pass through several different ecosystems. We kind of decompress during that time. It's our decompression time. We calm down, we relax. We talk about the native species that are growing there and the beauty that we encounter in the space. And then we talk about the seasons of life, but also the seasons that are found in nature. Each season affords a different experience. So if a family's selecting a gravesite in winter, it'll look starkly different to one that is being selected, a gravesite that's being selected in the summer. And each season is beautiful in its own way. And we really encourage a family to try to engage with nature when making a decision that way. Recently, when I had a family, we walked around and we um, we walked around several different spots. And for them, they came to one and they said, "This feels right." And it's a feeling, and that's what we're going for. A lot of times we ask them to consider when selecting a burial site, we consider them, would you want to sit here and have a picnic? Do you get that kind of feeling,
Yeah,
like,
I love
oh my
that.
gosh, I just love this space, there's something about it, I'd like to sit here for a little while and have lunch. Well, you know use those same elements in selecting a grave space that would be a forever place for someone that you love. And we also, we try to really engage people in dressing comfortably and dressing like they're going to a picnic or a hike in the woods for our burials.
Right.
Even our funeral directors that come from other funeral homes around, they will come and they're like so excited that they don't have to be in a suit and they get to be in nature all day.
Right.
It's like a little field trip for them. They love it. Um, but
And are
every
families coming back and having picnics ever? Is that
Oh
something
yeah,
that you're
oh
seeing?
yeah, we've got one coming up at the end of August. They'll be doing a wildflower meadow walk, and then they're going to have wine and cheese and sandwiches, and they'll sit near the grave site and
Hmm,
have a picnic.
that's
So
so
it'll be really
nice.
special. But every interaction that we have with nature, um, every time we connect with nature, it's really purposeful. From the memorial hike that we take with our families walking into the preserve, to the grave, to the intention or meditation that we create in the bottom of on the floor of the grave. Which, if you follow us on Instagram, you've seen, or if you've seen on our website, you've seen some of these meditations, or some
Hmm.
might call them like a mandala, or a something that's done, something beautiful that's created in love. Um, to the elements of when we lower someone in a casket or a shrouded body into the grave, we use grass ropes. And those grass ropes have a feeling and a texture. And I'm doing this as I'm talking to you, but it's very, it's sensory. So we really try to play into that sensory element of what we're doing. Um,
Okay.
as we lower that body into the soil, and how we begin returning the earth to the grave and covering it over wildflowers and planting ferns or whatever the case may be in any different situation. But we
Are,
really try to we try to create space for families that will allow them to create their own rituals and traditions. We think it's very important to act as guides during this process and
Mhm.
not to take away the profound ritual that they can experience. I think that's something with conventional funerals that um, we've kind of allowed or handed over to to professionals to do when we're actually losing out on something when we do that, and we need to stay closer. And the reason we've done that is because it's uncomfortable, and we'll get into that more here in a little bit, I'm sure. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Are families allowed to or able to help dig the grave?
they are. Yeah,
Okay. Does that happen often?
not very often. We have a lot
Okay.
of stones, so opening a grave in
Yeah.
our particular area along the Highland Rim in Tennessee can take anywhere from, it's generally on average about 4 to 6 hours to open a grave.
Okay.
We do a mixture of mechanical opening and hand digging. So there's an element of both
Mhm.
to open the grave, and then to close it is always manually. And the family actually participates wholeheartedly in that. But our staff and volunteers are always there in the event that someone doesn't enjoy that or
Of
or has a
course.
mobility challenge or special needs where they couldn't participate in that way. I recently had a lady that had a broken leg, and we have a UTV vehicle that's 4-wheel drive that's small and compact. So we popped her in there and drove her right up to the graveside, and she sat on a bench near the grave where she could not stand on this leg. Um, she broke both the tibia and fibula.
Oh.
And for her to be able to participate, her whole family was shoveling. So I went over and grabbed a handful of soil and I brought it over to her and I emptied it into her hands. And she sat there and she held it, and she kind of, I didn't instruct her to do anything special, but I could see her say a blessing or have a prayer or mm, let something go with that soil. And when she was ready, I took it back from her and I placed it in on the coffin. So it's just from the smallest little things that you can do to some of the more grand gestures.
And
I
it's
think
all adding ritual, a lot of
absolutely.
rituals that we just have completely lost
That's
over time, to be honest,
right.
right?
Yep.
And a question came in from Stacy. I wanted to actually ask that one because it's related to what we're talking about. And I don't know if I know this, but do you bury cremated remains as well, or is it just whole body burial?
We do allow for the burial of cremated remains.
Okay.
We actually handle cremated remains in a special way.
Mhm.
Cremated remains, if you didn't know, are acidic and have a high pH. So the calcified bone fragments that most people call ashes, um, the cremated remains cannot be directly deposited into the soil. And because we're sensitive to what goes into the ground at Larkspur and in a conservation element or conservation burial ground setting, what we do is we actually will amend or add an organic matter that
Mhm.
has been formulated by a company called Let Your Love Grow. And Mr. Jenkins, who started that company, has been great to work with us and help provide this for families who want to bury cremated remains in a natural setting. Because you can't just scatter ashes over the ground because they're acidic and the
Mhm.
plants, it's not good for the plant material. If you bury ashes and you attempt to plant a tree, the tree will not thrive. It will not grow through it. It will try to avoid the ashes at all costs. Um, Cremated remains are acidic and their pH level is the same of hair straightener or ammonia.
Wow. So this is a really important note for all of you.
Yes.
Those of you that are big fans of green and natural burial, those of you work with families or even just try to share information on social media. It's a really big issue, I would say, right now, where
Right.
everyone wants to be a tree, or
Uh-huh.
everyone wants their cremated remains to be planted and become a tree, like some of the popular urn companies out there,
Yeah.
but it's difficult and it's not really meant to work. So this is
Right.
super important information for all of
Right.
you
And
working in this
families
space.
and individual consumers can purchase Let Your Love Grow. If you wanted to do this in your own yard, you can purchase the amendment at letyourlovegrow.com,
Mhm.
maybe. Just search it on Google and you'll be able to find the material. You can order it. It has instructions on how to do everything. And you can safely deposit those in your garden or on your land and plant a tree. But we tell everybody at Larkspur, some people have already, there's a lot of people that have cremated remains in their closets or they've inherited them and they become the custodians of these ashes and they need to determine what to do with them. So they
Mhm.
find us at Larkspur and then we help them through that process. People that are planning ahead for themselves that say, well, I always just wanted to be cremated. Well, what they're telling me is that they actually probably just really wanted to avoid being embalmed, having makeup
Mm.
put on them, and being viewed in a metal casket and buried for $20,000 in a cemetery. That's probably what they're avoiding. So when they learn about natural burial, that generally is something that they shift to.
Yeah.
Because with natural burial, we can plant the tree. We're there are a there's a mycelium network in the ground at Taylor Hollow
Mhm.
that works like a mushroom suit. The grave space itself and placing the body there and using the body as a tool to save land and conserve land over time. By placing that body in there, it is like composting in a way. You're doing
Right.
the same thing. Um, Although all of those other elements have unique and special ways for people to express themselves at end of life. It's just important to understand what's important to you and then make a decision. So yeah.
Of course. Wow. So much to consider, and so many
And
misconceptions that are being
and
shared
another
right
and
now.
another
Yeah.
thing, I always we have to as humans stop cremating our bodies and putting our organic biomass and carbon matter into the air,
Mm.
and we need to return it to the soil. Because the soil has a huge benefit for the planet in pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the ground.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people are now trying to shoot their ashes into space.
Yeah, just send them with Jeff Bezos, right?
Oh my gosh, don't even.
And
One more question about Larkspur before we move on
mhm,
to a big crux of this conversation. Um, are there any markers at all at Larkspur? This was a question from Tatiana, and it's a great question. I know some natural burial sites do have markers, even just like little plaques, or they have ones that where like a boulder where there'll be many people's names on it, some type
right,
of memorial. Talk to us
right.
a little bit about that.
So, I mentioned a lot of rocks in the ground.
Mhm.
And fortunately for us in Tennessee, we have access to a lot of native stone.
Okay.
So myself and my staff will source and select native stones from our area that can be used to be engraved simply with the person's name and their years. We don't go into butterflies or rebel flags or anything else. We keep it very simple on a stone that is manageable and low profile that will not interrupt the view shed. So families can have a stone if they choose. It is optional. We always place a metal medallion on each gravesite and it's stamped with the person's name and information. That's the only non-biodegradable element at the grave at Larkspur. And that's used just as a physical metal identification tracker or something to look for if there's not a larger native stone. And then
Okay.
the third way that we go about mapping or tracking where our graves are is that we actually use a really strong GPS tower that's very similar to
Mm.
that used by electrical companies or roadway and engineers. And we will actually record GPS coordinates off where the family places the medallion on the day of the burial. We'll
Mhm.
record GPS points off of that spot, accurate within centimeters. So when we
Wow.
upload that into our software system, a family can come back in 20 years and type the person's name in, and it shows where they're buried within the preserve using Google Maps.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
Keeper actually also has a mobile app that does that, but because we're using people's phone's location services, the GPS coordinate
Right.
could be like 10 feet off, right? Which,
Right. It
yeah,
can be. We try once you get someone to the general area, they will be able to find the space. But you're right. With our phones, it is generally a little wishy-washy when it comes to getting you to the exact spot. But that's the reason that we use the high-powered GPS collection device.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I am getting a lot of questions about this, and of course, this is the subject matter of today. Talk to us about a typical day in the life of a green or conservation cemetery director.
Oh gosh.
What do you do all day? What do you do all week?
Um, well, this morning I was at a nursing facility having coffee with some people who are passionate about conservation. Um, but it's really different, you know. When I was in the conventional setting, you know, our superintendent or caretaker would come in and he would look at work orders and determine, you know, where do we need to go to repair a stone that's been broken, or we've got to mow and weed this section. We need to spray for wasps over here. We need to do this and that. And then there was quota, which is something that larger cemeteries have, especially larger cemeteries that are owned by a big company. Those types of cemeteries have a quota. But really, my focus is not quota based, it's people based, and it's planet based. So at Larkspur, our goal is the family experience, and how we can positively impact the environment at the same time. So I wear all kinds of hats from, you know, I'm like, I don't know. I always kind of wanted to be a botanist when I was a kid. I wanted to be a funeral director, a botanist, and a park ranger. Weird, right?
It's kind of like exactly what you're doing right now.
I know. So I play this role of like teacher. Sometimes I'm this chaplain, kind of ministerial guy, um, regardless of faith. Um, you know, I'm a naturalist. I'm a spokesperson for the nonprofit. I help create rituals. I hug trees. I dig graves. You know, landscape design, co-worker, and friends to both the people at and around the preserve, and to my coworkers as well. But there's these days are spent meeting with families and doing end of life planning, working with my staff and neighbor relations. I work with a lot of funeral directors and giving them the tools that they need to be able to properly serve a family that chooses cremation, to work with them on providing detailed information about natural burial to families choosing cremation, because a lot of times people just don't know that this is an option, and when they find out, um, they're definitely influenced by this option. And I also help a lot of healthcare workers, social workers, hospice, hospital staff, understand end of life affairs, both from a funeral home standpoint, but also from how natural burial works when someone asks about it that's in their care. Um, of course, the dreaded email, spreadsheets, going to the
Right.
post office, making deposits. The occasional rattlesnake is at the preserve, and we need to make sure that it's protected, along with all of the little cute butterflies and stuff. So I get a call. It's like, oh my gosh, there's a rattlesnake. I said, of course there is. It's in nature. You know, what do you expect? I'm like, did you get a picture
Amazing.
of it? And they're like, a picture? I could bear to look at it. But I
That's
try to get out there,
hilarious.
you know, and yeah, it's fun. There's no one thing that I do every single day. Um, it's just always a big mix of the different things, which
And so,
makes it enjoyable.
how is your team made up then? I'm assuming you have quite a lot of folks working the grounds, preparing the grave sites, tending to the land. I assume you have some admins that have to take care of all the paperwork. What are the roles within your team that helps you run everything?
So for me, I really do wear all of those hats, and will go out into the preserve and do a lot of land care and maintenance,
Wow.
and I do a lot of admin. But there are different elements where we need to focus in on the organizational structure. So we're a nonprofit organization. We have a board of directors that is not a working board of directors, but a supportive board of directors. And we really focus on when building that board of directors, having a diverse group of individuals with different wheelhouses that can help us support our mission and grow what we're doing. And then we have our administrative staff, and then we have our team that helps with burials. And then generally myself or David, our assistant director, will be on every burial, and or we meet with all of the families to coordinate all of the different aspects of what a burial could look like or what planning looks like. So yeah, a lot of different things, a little different bases that need to be covered.
Absolutely. It's just like any other business, but like even further.
Right, right.
Wonderful. And this question's coming from a lot of people. And as someone who also has a pipe dream to one day open up my own little green cemetery in my
Yeah,
neck of the woods, we can talk about it in a few contexts. Some folks are asking about if it's legal, if it's not legal. Technically, you're allowed to bury bodies, it's legal to bury bodies.
right.
But what are really some of the steps you need to take? What's some of the legislation, zoning, endowment funds? How do you actually get started on this process and open
Yeah,
up a cemetery?
it can be quite overwhelming. And I knew you were going to ask this question, so I made a list.
Good. Let's do it.
Because I knew this is something that people ask a lot, and I wanted to be able to convey it concisely to everyone that
Mhm,
was joining us today.
mhm.
Um, so the steps when someone says John Christian, hi, my name is John Smith. I live in Iowa, and there's this pasture beside my granddad's house, and I want to start a conservation burial ground there. Okay, let's just use that as an example. First, ask yourself if you're willing to commit your life to this place that you create. It's a great responsibility, and if you create it, you must also create a succession plan for when you can no longer serve as the captain of that ship. You're attempting to birth into the world something that will live on for as long as the planet survives. You're making a commitment to the people who you bury and their children and their children and their children and so on. First, that's the big one. And then if they're still biting at wanting to create the space after
Mhm.
that, identify the land that is in need of restoration and further protection. Do
Okay.
not take a pristine forest that does not need restoration and attempt to create a conservation burial ground on it.
It's going to need a lot of logging if you're going to have to do that. Finding
Right.
it's that's one of the hardest places to bury a body, right? In a forested, wooded
It
area,
is.
correct?
You want to avoid dense rooted systems. You
Yeah.
have to manage the ecology of a forest. If you have a pristine uh, forest or ecosystem, it doesn't need to be disrupted. And I fear that natural burial and conservation would do that. So
Mhm.
first, identify land in need of restoration and further protection. You may be protecting it from subdivision. You may be removing barbed wire fencing and restoring it from when it was grazed by cattle. A lot of different elements that you could look for there. Um, Also ask yourself what native people use the land, how and why.
Mhm.
We need to start really paying attention to that and paying respect to that.
Mhm.
Um, you have to respect the history of the land and the people that have been there before us. So I always say stop um, and really focus in on that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah,
The
speak to your
next
local
few things are
community.
gonna, huh?
I said speak to your local community.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The people that have lived there forever are going to have more about the local history than maybe the newspaper does. So start
Exactly.
there.
Yeah.
Um, the next are going to be more like do this, 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 and this. Number 3 on my list is check zoning rules in your community. Every community, no matter where it is, if it's across the state of Tennessee, everywhere is different. Check your zoning rules. If there's a board of zoning appeals in place, Start there for guidance within your community as to how is this land zoned, what are the steps to rezone it for special use or for cemetery use. Then based on your business model, whether you're for-profit, community organization, or nonprofit, talk with your state board of funeral directors and embalmers. And they funeral directors and embalmers / cemeteries. They kind of, it's all one group generally. Here in Tennessee it is. It may be different in others, but start there and determine the rules and regulations in your state. Again, every place is different, but start in your state with that group and try to understand the rules and regulations surrounding cemetery creation based on your type of business, whether it's for-profit, community, or nonprofit.
And so would the state board be the ones to be able, I guess it depends where you are, but is it like, is it the government, your state government that says, yes, you can open up a cemetery here? Or does your funeral board have any say in that? I guess depends where you are. I know in Ontario, you would have to get the approval, but I'm not sure how it is in certain parts of the states.
For here, the State Board of Funeral Directors and Embalmers oversees cemetery rules and regulations and creation. So you have to meet all of their criteria in order to create a cemetery.
What do you do if the criteria isn't green?
What do you mean if the criteria isn't green?
Well, I'm assuming, like in some states, they require you to have markers. They require you to have sometimes grave liners and vaults
Sure,
and certain
or
things that are
a
not
fence
green.
around the entire property that is not good for
Exactly.
wildlife. Um, that's a good question because luckily I didn't have a problem with that particular.
Okay.
I was not faced with a situation like that.
I
So
think
in
that's a
that
lot of
case,
issues with a lot of legislation. They're just not up to date with green
right, these are
practices.
old rules and laws that were
Yeah.
created a long time ago, and they generally have not been challenged. So
Yeah.
don't be surprised if you don't come across some things that seem very antiquated, like you need a 36-inch fence around this burial area. That's one that I've come across.
Yeah.
You know, so I would say ask for advice from and or challenge the rule or the board in making that decision. Tell them what your intention is and see how they can adopt or change the rule. If there was something that stated you had to use a certain type of marker or XYZ.
Okay.
And if you don't understand the rules and or laws, hire an attorney to help translate them. Yep. Attorneys that specialize in funeral and burial law. Number 5, meet with all neighboring property owners and anyone that may be affected by the activity of the burial ground. Tell them of your plan, listen to their concerns, educate them lovingly. Even just because someone says they don't want something doesn't mean that they aren't supportive. They don't understand, and they may have some trauma surrounding death. That's something that I've learned. People have trauma surrounding death. So lovingly educate and lean in when you start these conversations. And abort mission if you see a red flag. If your community cannot embrace your idea, then it won't work, even if you find a way to push forward. Okay. Lastly, how we started, build a team that will help you succeed.
It's a lot of work. There's a lot of steps to take. And that's why I think number 1 of, are you dedicated to this, is so important.
Right.
In some cases,
we charted our nonprofit in 2013, and we identified land by 2017. We opened for first burials in 2018.
Okay. Wow. Okay, we're getting a lot of questions. We only have a couple minutes left. People are asking a few questions around just quickly the cost of a plot at Larkspur versus at like a conventional cemetery. I think that's something that you'd be willing to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Larkspur, Our price we wanted to be very simple. If you go to a cemetery, you may get a price list that has 15, 20 different pages. At Larkspur, we wanted to have one price for everything. We didn't
Mhm.
want there to be classism in the burial ground. We didn't want separation in that way. We wanted everyone to be on an equal playing ground, if you will. Um, we priced our offering at $4,000. That includes opening and closing of the grave, the GPS, the native plant revegetation. That includes our genealogical history archive and data upload into our software system. That also includes a fund which we fund our endowment through the process of burial sales. So every burial sale, we take a portion of the proceeds and place it into a perpetual care fund. We also have a fund set aside for land conservation. So,
Mhm.
Mandy, when you buy your burial rights at Larkspur, you can feel good about knowing that we are actually going to take a portion of those funds and put them into a separate conservation fund that will allow us to buy and conserve additional acreage beyond the 112 that we currently have under protection now. Um, and
Wonderful.
we have to, in every business, whether you're a nonprofit or not, you have to set a price. Which I hate prices. I wish I could give it to everybody for free.
Right.
Um, but we have to set a price because it enables us to do the work that we need to do to care for the people and the land in an appropriate way. But as a nonprofit, we've created a fund to help serve everyone, regardless of their financial means. So that everyone can have access to Larkspur, regardless of their financial station in life. And we will not turn anyone away based on cost. So if a family comes to us and says, we don't have that much or we can't afford that, we say, well, what can you afford? And if they can't afford anything, then we will actually discount away. And we've created a fund that helps us absorb those costs. There is no cost for children and youth. So we really try to be mindful
Wow.
in our practices, knowing that we have to set a price, but also some people may not have the financial means to do that, and we don't want to turn them away based on cost. So
Well, first of all, I mean, $4,000, a few people in the comments already mentioned it's incredibly affordable. So many burial plots today in a traditional cemetery, you're looking at $10,000 plus, depending on the area where you are. So, first of all, it's really affordable. Second of all, the fact that you're donating land, you're donating a final resting place to people is amazing.
yeah,
And I'm sure, and I'm not sure if you already do this, but I'm sure if you told some people that, would you like to donate extra so that a family in need can have an interment, can have their loved one buried here if they can't afford it? I'm sure so many people would be willing to donate another $500 or something. That's,
absolutely. Larkspur's funded through the community and through the sale of burial rights.
yeah.
So there are no investors or shareholders. The public is the benefactor of the work. We had a gentleman recently whose wife was buried there, and he was so moved by his experience that he has set up auto payments to send us a donation every month.
Oh,
So we
that's
can use
amazing.
funds like that to help take care of parents who have lost twins, or an immigrant that has just moved to this country and needs to be taken care of because he's lying in the morgue somewhere.
Mhm.
And that's not just for us. This is extremely helpful to funeral directors that have to help people manage away at the end of life, and hospice social workers and nursing staff. So we're really trying to be mindful of all of the different aspects and all of the people that are helping at the end of life so that we can create the best experience for people.
Right. So we might have, I think, one more question, maybe two, depending on how long we take on this one. But this is being asked by a few people. And, the goal of this conversation is to really help guide our listeners through their career path. And one of the questions we're being asked by a few folks right now is, do you need to have been a funeral director or have solid experience in the funeral industry to work at or to open a conservation or a green burial plot?
You do not.
Okay.
Um, it's helpful to have a good knowledge of how and why the funeral industry is set up and managed the way that it is. It'll help you better play the game with them. It'll better help you understand how to include them, and it'll be easier for you to understand how to talk to families about what they might experience when their first call, when a death has occurred, is someone to move the body, which is generally a funeral director.
Mhm.
So it is helpful. And if it's not you that's taking the stern of the ship and being captain, if it's not you, if you're the one trying to create this, find someone that can stand alongside you that has that knowledge, or you know, pick up a job at the funeral home as a greeter. You know, you don't have to have a license as a funeral director to operate a cemetery or create a conservation burial ground. And you might actually be surprised at how many funeral directors really embrace the idea of natural burial, because it's historic in nature and it's how we were operating up until the point of the modernization of the funeral industry. So um, there's a lot of people that love the idea of going back to basics and simplicity in a way to help people.
Yeah, and I'd also like to say on that note, working at a funeral home is one thing, working at a cemetery is a completely other thing. They're so interconnected, but the jobs that you do at either facility are completely different. And so most of the time when cemeteries are hiring, I mean, obviously, like there's some cemeteries, I know that some of the ones near me, they just hire gardeners, like seasonal workers, like 30 seasonal like gardeners every summer. You can do that for a summer. I did, like all my friends did that in high school.
Right.
There's a lot of admin jobs. There's like accounting jobs. There's marketing jobs. There's
Yeah.
all of these other ways that you can use maybe your current skills to even just work at a cemetery and understand the day-to-day operations. It's going to be different in a conservation burial ground, but if you understand like the business behind how cemeteries work, you can also understand how you need to really run your own in that way.
You'll learn how to do some things right, and you'll learn how to avoid doing some things the way that they're currently being done. Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree.
wonderful. We're at our time. There's so many more things I could talk to you about and ask you about. We're just going to pull up some of our contact info, and you can all follow Talk Death and Keeper and Larkspur. These are our Facebooks and our Instagrams and our websites. Again, just obviously you're on the EOL email blast, but if maybe a friend of yours isn't, just have them follow Talk Death. We will definitely be posting these probably as early as next week. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have been able to talk to you about this. We've learned so much. John Christian, thank you so, so much for your time and
It's
for
an absolute pleasure. Thank you. And thanks for everybody to listening to me ramble.
it's been no rambling. It's been wonderful. Such amazing
Thank you.
information. Thank you so much to everyone. You were all wonderful. And also such an engaging chat. I love this. And again, we'll try to answer all of your questions offline. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.